If you don't like how things are run in this house, maybe you should stop acting like you still belong in it." The words hung in the air like something nobody at the table was supposed to hear, yet everyone did. It was a warm Saturday evening in a quiet suburban home just outside Chicago, where the backyard lights were softly glowing and the smell of roasted chicken filled the dining room. Margaret Collins, a 62-year-old woman with calm eyes and a steady presence, sat at the head of the table she had helped pay for, though no one seemed to remember that anymore. Across from her sat her husband Robert, 65, stiff in posture, his tone always sharper lately, like patience had become something he no longer believed in. Beside him was their son Ethan, 30, quietly scrolling his phone more than engaging with the room, and next to Ethan sat Lisa, 28, his wife, who smiled too often in ways that never quite reached her eyes. The dinner table had once been a place of laughter, shared stories, and long conversations about weekends and holidays, but lately it felt more like a stage where everyone knew their role, even if Margaret no longer recognized hers. Lisa was the first to break the comfort, casually mentioning how modern households work better when everything has clear leadership, her gaze briefly landing on Margaret as if the sentence carried a second meaning. Robert gave a slow nod, not interrupting, not correcting, simply agreeing. Margaret noticed, but she said nothing, continuing to cut her food into small, precise pieces, as she always did when she was thinking too deeply to speak. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional. Ethan laughed softly at something on his phone, unaware of the shift happening around him. The house itself seemed quieter than usual, like even the walls were waiting for something to happen. Robert cleared his throat, leaning back slightly in his chair, and looked across the table at Margaret with an expression that was not anger yet, but something colder and more certain. Lisa stopped smiling. Even Ethan looked up without fully understanding why. The moment did not come suddenly. It built slowly, like pressure gathering. Behind a door that had already been locked from the inside, Margaret finally lifted her eyes and met Robert's gaze, steady and unreadable, as if she had already seen this version of him coming long before tonight. The chandelier light above them flickered faintly, casting soft shadows across the table, and in that fragile pause, it felt like the entire house was waiting for one decision that no one had yet spoken out loud. The silence at the table did not break immediately, it tightened. Robert's eyes stayed fixed on Margaret as if he had already decided what kind of person she was going to be in the next few seconds. Lisa shifted slightly in her seat, sensing opportunity, her voice soft but deliberate as she added that sometimes households function better when everyone understands their place clearly, letting the words linger just long enough to feel intentional without sounding openly cruel. Ethan finally lifted his gaze from his phone, noticing the atmosphere, but still not fully understanding its weight. Margaret remained still, her hands resting near her plate, her expression calm in a way that made it difficult to read whether she was unaffected or simply choosing not to respond. Robert leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm, cutting through the fragile quiet of the room as he said that things in the house had become confusing lately, and that confusion had to end. He paused, as if measuring the impact of what he was about to say, then continued with a finality that made the air feel heavier, stating that from this point forward Margaret would sleep in the garage. The sentence landed without drama from his side, as if it were a simple correction to a problem that had already been solved in his mind. Lisa looked down quickly, hiding a small expression that suggested satisfaction, while Ethan's face shifted into disbelief that had no direction yet. The house seemed to shrink around the table, the familiar warmth of dinner replaced by something colder and unfamiliar. Margaret did not react immediately. She looked at Robert for a long moment, her eyes steady, not searching for permission or explanation, but acknowledging the reality of what had just been said. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and spoke a single word, calm and even, saying okay. There was no emotion attached to it that anyone could easily identify, and that made it more unsettling than resistance would have been. Lisa blinked, as if expecting something else, perhaps tears or argument, while Robert frowned slightly, unsure if he had achieved what he intended or something else entirely. Ethan looked between them, sensing a shift he could not name. Margaret slowly pushed her chair back and stood, not hurried, not defiant, simply complete in her movement. She placed her napkin beside her plate, as though ending a normal meal, and turned away from the table. No one stopped her. As she walked past the doorway toward the hallway that led deeper into the house, the sound of the dining room behind her continued in fragments, small noises of confusion and reassessment that no one fully voiced. Robert remained seated, his posture still rigid, but his eyes followed her longer than he intended. Lisa broke the silence first with a quiet comment about how some people finally learn, though her voice lacked certainty. Ethan said nothing. Margaret reached the hallway and paused only briefly, looking at the familiar space she had lived in for years, before continuing forward with the same steady pace, as if the direction of her life had already changed long before anyone else realized it. Margaret continued walking down the hallway without turning back, her steps steady and unhurried, as though the words spoken at the table had not altered her rhythm, but only confirmed something she had already understood for a long time. Behind her, the dining room returned to a low murmur of uncertainty, but she no longer engaged with it. The house felt different as she moved through it, not because anything physical had changed, but because the meaning of every space seemed to shift with each step she took. Family photographs lined the wall, familiar moments frozen in time, yet tonight they felt distant, like memories belonging to someone else. She reached the staircase briefly but did not go up. Instead, she turned toward the side hallway that led to the garage entrance, a path she had never once considered before this evening. The door to the garage was slightly cold to the touch when she placed her hand on the handle, and she paused for only a moment before opening it. The garage light flickered on, revealing a space that was orderly but lifeless, filled with stored boxes, seasonal decorations, and items that had slowly been forgotten over the years. She stepped inside and gently closed the door behind her, not with hesitation, but with finality. Upstairs, the sound of chairs shifting and voices attempting to resume normal conversation could be faintly heard through the walls, as if the house itself was trying to pretend nothing had changed. In the kitchen, Lisa whispered something to Robert about how things were finally settling into a proper structure, though her tone carried a slight uncertainty that contradicted her words. Ethan stood near the doorway of the dining room, watching the hallway where his mother had disappeared, his expression caught between confusion and hesitation, but he said nothing. Robert eventually rose from the table and walked a few steps toward the hallway, stopping just short of it, as if expecting something to call him back or challenge what had just happened, but only silence answered him. In the garage, Margaret looked around slowly, taking in the space not as punishment, but as environment, as though she was assessing something rather than accepting it. She noticed a small workbench in the corner, a folding chair, and a narrow window that let in the faint glow of the streetlight outside. She placed her hand on the chair for a moment, then sat down, her posture straight, her expression calm and unreadable. She reached into her bag and took out a small notebook she always carried, opening it to a blank page. For a long moment, she simply listened, not to the house above her, but to the silence around her, which felt different from the silence at the table. Upstairs, Robert returned to his seat, and Lisa resumed speaking in softer tones about how boundaries were important, but even she seemed to be filling space rather than expressing certainty. Ethan finally asked quietly if this was really necessary, but no one gave him a clear answer. In the garage, Margaret began to write a single line in her notebook, slowly and deliberately, as though marking the beginning of something that had already been decided long before anyone else understood it. The garage was quiet in a way that felt heavier than silence, as if the air itself had slowed down to match Margaret's breathing. She sat still for a long moment after writing the first line in her notebook, her pen resting lightly between her fingers. Above her, the faint sounds of movement in the house continued, chairs shifting, a cabinet closing, the distant sound of someone speaking in a tone that tried too hard to sound normal. Margaret did not look upward. Instead, she focused on the page in front of her, as if it contained more truth than anything happening in the rooms above. After several minutes, she wrote another line, slower this time, and then closed the notebook halfway, without pressing it shut completely. In the main house, Robert had returned to the dining table, though the conversation no longer carried the same structure it had before. Lisa was speaking more than anyone else, filling the silence with observations about order and respect, repeating ideas that sounded confident but were beginning to feel rehearsed even to her own ears. Ethan finally stood from his chair and walked a few steps toward the hallway again, pausing as if expecting to see his mother return at any moment, but the hallway remained empty. He asked quietly whether she was actually going to stay in the garage, his voice uncertain, but Robert responded without looking up, saying only that sometimes people needed time to understand their place. The words were calm, but they did not invite discussion. Ethan looked between his father and the empty hallway, then slowly sat back down, though his attention never returned to his phone. In the garage, Margaret finally stood and placed the notebook back into her bag. She walked a few steps toward the small window and looked outside at the quiet suburban street, where a few porch lights glowed softly and a car passed at a steady speed, unaware of anything happening inside this house. She rested her hand lightly on the edge of the workbench, noticing small details she had never paid attention to before, such as the worn wood surface and the neatly arranged tools that had not been used in years. There was no sign of distress in her expression, only a steady awareness, as if she was observing a situation that required patience rather than reaction. Upstairs, Lisa lowered her voice and suggested that this arrangement might actually bring clarity to the household, though her words lacked the certainty she was trying to project. Robert nodded once, but his gaze drifted again toward the hallway, lingering longer than before. The house itself felt divided now, not by walls but by attention, as if every room contained a different version of the same moment. Margaret returned to the chair and sat down again, this time leaning back slightly, allowing herself to rest without urgency. She placed her bag beside her and looked at the closed garage door for a long time, not with expectation, but with calculation. Above her, the family continued speaking in fragments, trying to stabilize something that was already shifting beneath them, unaware that the quiet decision made in the garage was no longer about where someone would sleep, but about everything that would come after. The night had settled deeper over the house, and what remained of the evening felt stretched and fragile, as if any sudden sound could break it. In the garage, Margaret sat in the same chair, but her posture had changed slightly, more relaxed now, as though she had stopped resisting the space she was placed in and started observing it instead. She opened her notebook again and reviewed the lines she had written earlier, her expression steady, not emotional, but focused in a way that suggested she was organizing thoughts that did not belong to confusion anymore. Above her, faint footsteps moved across the second floor, followed by the soft closing of doors and occasional voices that tried to sound casual but carried a thin layer of tension beneath them. Lisa had moved into the kitchen and was speaking about rearranging expectations within the household, suggesting that structure would benefit everyone, but her tone now carried less confidence than before, as if she was testing her own words against the silence that followed. Robert stood near the hallway for a moment longer than necessary, looking down the dark corridor that led toward the garage door, then finally turned away and returned to the dining room without saying anything further. Ethan remained near the edge of the living room, no longer on his phone, his attention divided between the voices and the quiet space where his mother had gone, his expression unsettled but still without action. In the garage, Margaret listened not to the voices directly but to the pattern of them, the way they rose and fell, the way certainty in the house seemed to weaken with each passing minute. She stood up again and walked slowly around the small space, noticing details she had overlooked before, such as the slight draft near the corner and the way the light from the street outside changed as cars passed. She stopped near the workbench and placed both hands lightly on its surface, not leaning, simply grounding herself in the physical stillness. Upstairs, Lisa suggested that perhaps tomorrow would feel more normal, but there was no response that followed her statement, only a pause that stretched longer than she intended. Robert eventually said that things had been decided and there was no point in revisiting them, yet his voice lacked the firmness it had carried earlier in the evening. Ethan quietly asked if his mother needed anything, but no one answered immediately, and the question faded into the room without direction. In the garage, Margaret returned to her chair and sat down again, closing her notebook fully this time. She placed it beside her and looked straight ahead at the closed garage door, her face calm, her breathing even, as if she had stepped out of the emotional current of the house entirely. The sounds above continued, but they no longer seemed connected to her in the same way. Instead, they felt distant, like echoes of a version of life that was already beginning to shift into something else. She remained still for a long time, not waiting, not reacting, simply present in a space that no longer felt like an end, but like the quiet beginning of something no one else in the house had yet understood. The early hours of the night stretched across the house in a way that felt slower than time itself, as if every room was holding its breath and waiting for something to break the stillness. In the garage, Margaret remained seated, but she was no longer motionless in thought. She opened her notebook again and began reviewing what she had written earlier, her pen moving occasionally as she added small notes, not emotional reflections, but structured observations, as if she was documenting patterns rather than feelings. Above her, the house was quieter now, with only occasional footsteps and the soft hum of distant conversation drifting through the floor. Lisa had stopped speaking for long stretches, her earlier confidence replaced by pauses that lasted too long, as if she was no longer sure the direction of the evening supported her interpretation of it. Robert remained in the dining room longer than necessary, sitting without speaking, his hands resting on the table, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the hallway that led to the garage door. Ethan had moved between rooms twice, once standing near the kitchen and once near the living room window, each time stopping as if deciding whether to say something, but ultimately remaining silent. In the garage, Margaret adjusted the small lamp beside her chair and continued writing, not quickly, not slowly, but with consistent focus, as though she was building something invisible line by line. The sound of a car passing outside briefly illuminated the window, casting a moving shadow across the garage wall, and she paused only for a moment before continuing. Upstairs, Lisa finally asked Robert if this situation was really sustainable, her voice quieter than before, and Robert did not answer immediately, which itself became the answer in the silence that followed. Ethan eventually asked again if they should check on his mother, and this time his tone carried more insistence, but Robert only responded that she had made her choice, though his eyes did not fully meet Ethan's. In the garage, Margaret closed her notebook again and placed it carefully on the workbench. She stood and walked slowly to the center of the space, looking around not as someone confined, but as someone evaluating. The concrete floor was cool beneath her feet, and the air carried a stillness that felt separate from the rest of the house. She noticed how the sound insulation created distance between her and the life above, not complete separation, but enough to make the upstairs voices feel like a different environment entirely. She returned to her chair and sat down once more, folding her hands in her lap, her expression calm and unreadable. Upstairs, the conversation had shifted into smaller fragments, no longer structured, as if each person was trying to maintain stability without fully understanding what stability now meant. Robert finally stood and walked toward the hallway again, stopping at the threshold where the light changed, and for a long moment, he simply stood there, listening. Lisa followed behind him but did not approach fully, staying several steps back as if uncertain whether to continue or retreat. Ethan remained behind them, watching both of them and then looking toward the closed garage door. In that moment, the house felt divided not by rooms, but by awareness, as if each person was slowly realizing that nothing about the evening had resolved in the way it was expected to, and Margaret, in the quiet of the garage, remained the only one who no longer seemed to be waiting for the situation to change. The house had entered a quieter phase, but it was not calm. It was the kind of silence that formed after words had already changed the meaning of everything, leaving people unsure of what should come next. In the garage, Margaret remained seated for a long time without moving, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her expression steady in a way that no longer suggested uncertainty. She was no longer writing, no longer reacting, only observing the space around her as if it belonged to a different layer of reality than the one unfolding above her. Occasionally, the faint sound of movement traveled through the ceiling, a chair shifting, a cabinet closing too carefully. Footsteps that no longer had a clear direction. Upstairs, Robert stood near the hallway again, his presence heavier than before, as if the act of standing there required more effort than he wanted to admit. He did not call out, did not descend into the garage, but simply remained in place, listening to a silence that no longer responded to him. Lisa approached slowly from behind, her voice softer now as she suggested that perhaps the situation had been misunderstood, but even as she spoke, she seemed less certain that her words carried influence. Ethan lingered a few steps away, watching both of them, and then glancing toward the hallway that led to the garage, his hesitation growing into something more defined, though still unspoken. In the garage, Margaret finally stood again and walked toward the small window, looking out at the quiet suburban street where everything appeared unchanged, porch lights glowing steadily, distant headlights passing without interruption, a world continuing without awareness of the tension inside the house. She placed one hand lightly against the window frame, not pressing, simply resting, and allowed herself to remain still for several moments. Above her, Robert finally spoke again, his voice lower than before, not commanding, not confident, but controlled in a way that suggested restraint rather than certainty. He said that things had been decided earlier and should remain as they were, yet the lack of response that followed made the statement feel incomplete, as if it had no place to land. Lisa did not immediately agree this time, instead looking toward Ethan as if searching for confirmation that was not arriving. Ethan finally asked whether this was really necessary, and his question lingered in the air longer than anything Robert had said that night. No one answered him directly. In the garage, Margaret returned to her chair and sat down again, this time without opening her notebook. She placed her hands together, calm and still, and looked straight ahead at the closed door. The sound of the house above continued in uneven patterns, but none of it reached her in the same way anymore. The separation between the two spaces had become clearer, not physically, but in awareness, as if one side of the house was still trying to maintain control over a situation that the other side had already stopped reacting to. Robert eventually stepped back from the hallway, his posture less rigid than before, and returned slowly to the dining room without speaking. Lisa followed after a pause, her earlier confidence replaced by silence that felt heavier than her words. Ethan remained near the hallway a moment longer, then finally turned away, though his eyes lingered on the direction of the garage door before he moved. In the garage, Margaret did not move. She remained seated, composed, and quiet, as the house above continued to shift in small, uncertain ways, and for the first time that night, the imbalance between what was said and what was understood no longer seemed to favor the people upstairs. The night had deepened further, and the house no longer carried the feeling of an argument in progress, but rather the lingering weight of something unresolved that no one knew how to properly close. In the garage, Margaret remained seated in the same chair, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that no longer seemed dependent on what was happening upstairs. She had stopped writing entirely, the notebook resting closed beside her, as if the need to record anything had already passed. The silence around her felt structured now, not empty, but arranged, like she had begun to understand its shape instead of resisting it. Above her, the house was quieter, but not settled. Robert sat at the dining table with his hands clasped loosely, staring at a point that was no longer part of the conversation. Lisa stood near the kitchen counter, no longer speaking with certainty, occasionally adjusting objects that did not need adjustment, as if physical movement could restore clarity to a situation that no longer offered it. Ethan remained near the hallway again, more still than before, his attention fixed on the closed path leading toward the garage, his expression marked by hesitation that had turned into quiet concern. No one had moved toward resolution, yet no one had fully stepped away either. In the garage, Margaret stood slowly and walked toward the center of the space again, not with urgency, but with deliberate calm. She looked around at the stored boxes and unused items, then toward the small window where the night outside remained unchanged, indifferent to the tension inside the house. She placed her hand lightly on the workbench and then withdrew it, as if acknowledging the space without needing to claim it. Above her, Robert finally spoke again, but his voice lacked the firmness it had carried earlier in the evening. He said that the situation had been explained and should not be questioned further, yet even as he spoke, he did not move closer to the hallway. Lisa added softly that sometimes families needed boundaries to function, but her tone carried uncertainty that made the statement feel more like an attempt than a conclusion. Ethan finally stepped closer to the hallway entrance, pausing there, then asking again if this was really how things were going to stay, his voice quiet but no longer passive. The question remained unanswered for several seconds, stretching into a silence that no one filled. In the garage, Margaret returned to her chair and sat down again, her movements measured and calm. She placed her hands in her lap and looked forward, not at the door, not at the walls, but at a fixed point that suggested she was no longer waiting for the house above to decide what it was. The separation between the two levels of the home felt more defined now, not through distance, but through awareness, as if each space had begun operating under different assumptions of control. Robert eventually stood and walked a few steps away from the table, then stopped, his posture less certain than before. Lisa followed him with her eyes, but did not speak. Ethan remained near the hallway, still and undecided. In the garage, Margaret did not move again. She remained seated, composed, and fully present in the quiet, as the house above continued its uneven stillness, and the meaning of the evening shifted without announcement into something no longer dependent on permission or reaction. The house had fallen into a stillness that no longer felt temporary, as if the night itself had accepted the changes that the people inside were still struggling to understand. In the garage, Margaret remained seated, her posture calm and grounded, her presence no longer reacting to the movement above but existing alongside it, as something separate and self-contained. The notebook remained closed beside her, and she did not reach for it again. Instead, she simply observed the space, the faint shadows cast by the single light bulb, the quiet outline of stored objects that no longer carried any emotional weight. Upstairs, the final hours of the night passed with minimal conversation. Robert sat alone at the dining table for a long stretch, his hands no longer clasped, his gaze lowered, as if reviewing something that could not be corrected by speech. Lisa moved between the kitchen and living room without purpose, occasionally stopping as if expecting the house to respond differently than it did, but it remained unchanged. Ethan stood near the hallway more than once, each time closer than before, but never crossing the threshold into action. In the garage, Margaret finally stood again and walked slowly toward the center of the space. She looked up briefly, not toward the ceiling, but toward the idea of what the house had been earlier that evening, then returned her attention forward. There was no urgency in her movements, no anticipation of interruption. She placed one hand lightly on the workbench, then let it rest there for a moment before stepping back. Above her, Robert eventually rose from the table and walked toward the hallway one final time. He stopped at the same point he had stopped before, but this time he did not remain as long. He turned away and returned to the dining room without speaking. Lisa watched him and did not follow immediately. Ethan finally moved closer to the hallway entrance and stood there longer than he had all night, his silence no longer uncertain but reflective. In the garage, Margaret returned to her chair and sat down again, her movements unhurried and complete. She looked forward, not at the door, not at the walls, but at a point that suggested continuity rather than waiting. The separation within the house had become consistent now, not defined by conflict, but by understanding that no single voice would restore what had shifted. Upstairs, no further attempts were made to reframe the situation. The conversations had dissolved into quiet intervals, each person left with their own interpretation of what had occurred, none of them fully aligned with the others. Robert eventually turned off the dining room light, leaving only the dim glow from the kitchen. Lisa stood still, then slowly moved toward the stairs without speaking. Ethan remained near the hallway for a final moment, then stepped back into the living room, his attention no longer fixed on the garage door. In the garage, Margaret remained seated, her expression unchanged, her presence steady and uninterrupted. The house above continued in silence, not empty, but unresolved. And in that unresolved quiet, the night reached its final shape, where nothing more needed to be said for the shift to remain complete.